India by the Bay is back with 10 special events to mark 10 years of Asia Society's inception in its beautiful heritage site. Every month we will be bringing to you music, theatre, dance, literature, film and so much more. A platform for collaboration and excellence which is in many ways epitomized by the wonderful Asia Society in Hong Kong. Join us every month online to view our digital series and celebrate 10 years of Asia Society, Hong Kong, along with India by the Bay.
This year, Asia Society Hong Kong Center celebrates its 10th anniversary in this beautiful site. We are so grateful to Sanjoy, Lakshmi, and the entire team from Teamwork for collaborating with Asia Society Hong Kong to be able to bring some of the best arts and cultural events from India to Hong Kong. We look forward to continued collaborations in the year ahead.
Welcome back to India by the Bay 2022 in partnership with Asia Society Hong Kong. Today we're going to talk about a woven narrative, Kashmiri Shawl by Romi Lamba. Romi Lamba has 30 years of experience in the financial services industry, and he was until recently the co-president of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Prior to joining HKEX, Mr. Lamba was a senior advisor to JP Morgan's Asia Investment Banking and Capital Markets business with strategic and operating responsibilities from 2008. He's also worked at Merrill Lynch Asia Pacific for 8 years as a managing director, where he led the firm's regional energy and power investment banking group and served as its chief operating officer of the firm's China origination business. During a lifetime that has taken the Indian-born Romi Lamba from the university in Philadelphia to his long-term home in Hong Kong, he's always been a collector. His journey started with antiques before moving on to Japanese ceramics, South Asian textiles, and in the late 1990s, modern and contemporary South Asian art. Lamba recalls that in 1994, we moved to Hong Kong and began to collect Indian contemporary art. Certain behaviors were now ingrained, a connection to his home country, a diaspora's magnet. Romi Lamba, welcome to India by the Bay.
Hi, Sanjoy. How are you?
Romi, you've been collecting for 30 odd years, and you've gone from everything from textiles and beautiful shawls to ceramics. And of course, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you started collecting Indian contemporary art. But how did this bug sort of bite you?
I think it was a combination of a couple of things. One is living in the US and at the time, and you made a reference to being part of the Indian diaspora. I was keen, my wife and I were keen to find a connection with India. And a lot of the things, if you travel back to India, that you could buy or collect were of mixed quality, particularly before the mid to late 1990s. Even the Indian contemporary art scene was quite mixed. And we stumbled upon the shawls originally in Philadelphia and later on in New York. And I just found that this was a field, the field of these particular woven textiles that were quite unique, not just in India, but also with their influence in Europe and the rest of the world. And it was a very finite period of time that they were manufactured for about 100 years, between the late 18th century until the late 19th century, and we can talk more about that. And so it was 100 years of a particular art or field. And it's something that we got into, and it has stuck with me. And I've continued to collect these for the last 30 years. Every year I add at least 2 or 3 shawls to my collection.
Romi, you talked about the diaspora connection, and it's quite interesting that so much of India art today belongs to the diaspora, especially in America. You have the largest collection of Indian miniatures. You have, of course, the rumals that sit there. You have so many pichwais sitting in Seattle. Is this a sense of nostalgia, or is this a sense of let's preserve what we have and we have the wherewithal to do so? Why? What's the connection?
I would say it's a bit of both. I think being being able to afford some of those items by living in the West is part of the story. But at the same time, there is a culture, I believe, in the West, which is influenced by museums, by collecting, by research, and exposure to the fields. So, for example, when it comes to textiles and shawls, there's a publication in London called Harley, HALI, which is quite well known for its articles and texts on textiles, carpets, and so on. I believe it would be difficult to subscribe to something like that in India, and you could potentially. Whereas living in the West, you have much more access. When I was younger and started collecting shawls, and I would go on business trips to Boston or New York or Washington, D.C., I would go out of my way to visit museums, make appointments to see some of their shawl collections, which were not always displayed, but much harder to do all of that in India itself.
Romi, a lot of Indians, when they're in the country itself, very rarely step into a museum. Of course, because traditionally the museum has been really dust laden and not necessarily the most exciting place to go to. And yet these same people, when they go to a New York or to a London or any other place, makes a beeline to museum. What's the difference? What do we need to do to be able to build our museum growing passion here in India and improve the lot of such beautiful and valuable stuff that we have here?
Well, it is a little bit of a tale of two cities, even within India. If you look at contemporary art, and you have the NGMAs, which are the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bombay and Delhi, those were set up in the last 20 years. And there's more effort and modernness in those museums, and they are easier to access. The lighting is better. Everything is a little bit more similar to what you see in the West. But if you want to see shawls in India, and you go to some of the textile museums, I've been to the one in New Delhi and maybe others, it's a different generation. They were set up 50, 70 years ago. The condition is not as good. So I think there does need to be an effort, maybe pushed by the private sector or individuals, to preserve these older art forms that India is so famous for.
Romi, you talked about how you started collecting, but were you trained, or did you train your eye and your fingers over a period of time, both of you, you and Sagri? How did you sort of discern the fake from the real and understand the pricelessness of some of the work that you've been able to collect?
I think a lot of it is research driven. There are, and as I said, this is a limited field. So there's a few books now more on this topic. And but really it's about finding these shawls, feeling them, touching them, viewing them. And when it comes to fakes, it's not easy to fake them as such. the age of the textile, very often on average, they're about 100 years old. And the only element of fake is what they manufactured in India, in which case, or close South Asia, in which case they were hand woven, hand loomed, or what they made in Europe, in which case they were so-called machine loomed. But even those shawls are no longer made. So it's not so much of being a fake, it's just where is the origin from and being able to distinguish between the two.
I'm sure many of our listeners would love to know, how do you preserve the collection that you have? Textiles is difficult to preserve and it needs careful handling. Do you wear your shawl out on a special occasion, or do you keep them rolled up? How do you preserve them?
We don't wear them out too much because honestly, they're quite heavy and bulky. And you'll see later on when I go through some slides of my shawls, and you'll see in the materials, if you ever look at books on shawls, especially the shawls made for the Western market for export, as well as the shawls made for India, sometimes could be 10, 12 feet by 4, 5 feet or 6 feet square. So they're quite hard to wear in today's day and age. And a lot of the ladies and men who wear shawls prefer the more modern pashminas, the plainer ones where the embroidery is not weighing down the shawl. We've been fortunate that Hong Kong actually is a good place to preserve shawls and textiles. It's a little humid, but it doesn't have a lot of insects. And we've lived here for close to 30 years, and the shawls have held up very well. Whereas I have seen other places, including India, where the climate, exposure to sea air or other factors and insects can damage the textiles much more.
Did you want to start by telling us about the shawl that you have behind you?
Sure. And what I can do perhaps is just fast forward a little bit into the slideshow so I have it on screen as well. So that's the shawl that is behind me. And I describe it here as the unusual all-over pattern Kashmiri shawl. So it's made in Kashmir, probably dating back to a little over 100 years ago. It's very hard to date these shawls exactly, but probably between 1820 and 1840. And the reason it's unusual, and also why it's an all-over shawl, is it has no plain center. Normally, as we'll go through later, shawls over time had very large plain centers, and as they progressed, the designs progressed, the centers became smaller, but there was always a plain center for most shawls. And this particular shawl doesn't have a center, and it's called an all-over pattern because it's just a repeat of paisleys in different colors and in different shapes and sizes. But the overall, when you look at the border of the shawl, which you can see on the slide, the colors of the border, which is predominantly three, there's a maroon or red, there's a green, and there's a yellow, are the three predominant colors in the shawl itself, in the paisleys or the bottes, as they're also referred to. And that gets reflected in the border.
And how did you chance upon this particular shawl?
This shawl I acquired from one of the dealers I deal with in India. A lot of it is over the internet or over WhatsApp or over email. And these dealers will send me particular shawls they chance upon for sale. And it's helpful that I reached the point in recognizing the different designs. And but I don't, most of the time now, I don't get the opportunity to touch them or feel them. But you can usually tell by the detail. And then, of course, I ask them about condition and so on.
Have you ever been disappointed when the actual shawl is finally landed in your doorstep?
Yes, of course. And I think it's more to do with specific elements, with fineness or coarseness. I don't think the disappointment has been that, oh my God, this is a fake shawl, because as I said, it's not easy to fake the shawls, but it's more that it's not as fine, or the colors are not as bright, and so on. So it's not big disappointments, but or the condition. Sometimes if there are holes or if there's other damage, it doesn't always show up in photographs.
So before I ask you to do the presentation, Romi, one last thing. Do you have any tips that, after all, this is a session about collecting. Do you have any tips that you would give our audiences today when it comes to collecting? Any wisdom?
I do. And I think it's really, if you're going to collect, and it's not just about shawls, it could be anything. If you're going to collect art, if you're going to collect wine, if you're going to collect whatever your passion or interest might be, I think it is important. I always emphasize research and discipline and focus. I think it is important to buy books or go on the internet. It is important for touch and feel, or in the case of other things, to taste them or to whatever it might be. I think it's difficult to collect seriously without going through that exercise. Um, and as you just mentioned, often when you do that, you can make mistakes or you have disappointments, but in the long run, it pays off.
So research, and get to know the product or the piece that you're going to acquire. And we'll come back at the end of the presentation. Romi, I'm going to ask you about provenance and how does that matter today, and how do you actually ensure that? But right now, let's go to the presentation of this beautiful collection. Romi's put together a special presentation for us to share some of the few pieces in his collection. Romi, over to you.
Okay, and I'm going to intersperse this with a little bit of the history of these shawls and these designs. And so the first slide I referred to is two miniatures. I think these are both from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, from the Mughal era. And these shawls probably started in the 16th and 17th centuries. And mostly they were worn by men, not by women. And very often they were worn as waistbands or over the shoulder. If they're worn around the waist, you call them patkas. Sometimes as headbands, and sometimes as full coats, and sometimes as what we now know as shawls over the shoulders. But the designs, as well as the fineness of the wool, traces back to these 2 or 3 centuries in the Mughal era. And it really wasn't until the late 18th century, around maybe 1780, 1790, when the Europeans were coming to India to trade with India, or you had the French or the British or the Portuguese or others occupy parts of India, that these shawls started making their way to the West. And there was a lot of interest in them. And this is an example of a relatively early shawl from my collection. It's all the shawls I'm showing today are made in India. I'm in the interest of time and focus, not going to touch on so much on the European shawls. But you will notice in a few places, part of the way you can date these shawls is you had European painters paint portraits with the subjects wearing the shawl. So here you have the portrait of a German princess by a European artist in 1828. And the shawl in that picture is very similar to the one in my collection. And in the early days, the paisleys were smaller. They were largely on the border, and you had a large center. And this is a patka. This is more like what you would call a scarf or a stole today. The later shawls were wider and more square and rectangular. This is more long and narrow, and very typical for the early shawls. And then as time progressed, you will see the borders started becoming more elaborate. So here we have a pair of red shawls. The first one is, the top one is a little bit earlier because the border is simpler. The bottom one, you can see that the center has become smaller. You've got a sort of double border of 2 rows of paisleys with little stripe borders in between. And then what became very common in both shawls is you have in the center, in the corners, the 4 corners of the center, you have these paisleys that were embroidered. So while the rest of the shawl is all woven using pashmina threads, in those 4 corners of the center, you often had these embroidered paisleys. And here you can see one of the shawls, the earlier one, on the right, and on the left is again a European painting dated to 1822 with what looks like a very similar shawl in terms of design and color. And here are some details of the 2 shawls that we're discussing. And you'll see that the paisley started becoming more elaborate, but they were still contained within compartments or a very geometrical feel to how the layout of the overall shawl was. And now we move on to slightly later shawl. And this is called a Harlequin shawl because the border had multiple panels using different colors. And Harlequin in the West refers to sometimes to the circus or clowns, but it also refers to the mixed use of colors and pattern. And so these shawls, it's a little more unusual and quite attractive, are called Harlequin shawls. This particular shawl, we actually bought in Philadelphia some 30 years ago and sent it back to India and changed the center. It was originally a red center and bigger, but it was damaged. So we made it smaller and changed the center to make it white. And this is a shawl that my wife has worn over the years more often because it's a bit lighter and easier to wear. This is the same shawl on the right and a painting on the left called After the Ball from 1874, which has a Harlequin shawl and is somewhat similar, except the center is more yellow. Okay, now we're talking about a slightly different type of shawl. These are more common in the Indian market or less found in the export market. And these striped shawls are also called khatras, and very often they're referred to as Jammehar shawls, which this overall area is called Jammehar in India. And this particular shawl also you'll see in the bottom right, and it is highlighted over here, has an embroidered design on it, which some people say indicated that it was made for royal customers, and so they would put their particular logos or designs. And these are very fine and light shawls using the best pashmina and are quite hard to find. Similarly, here's another one, quite similar, striped khatra shawl, very fine, and you can see that in the colors and the pattern at the bottom. Another word you will see that pops up on the title of these shawls is kani, which is a description of the type of weaving, also known in India as Jammehar, which is these shawls are woven very much like carpets. And we'll see. So these are, I'll show you shortly some drawings from the contemporary period that show the Rafugars making the shawls. But here are the same two striped shawls. And on the left, a painting by Ingres of a portrait of a lady with a shawl that is quite similar in style and coloring, dating to 1823, of a striped shawl. And this is an unusual shawl in that it's two shawls assembled together. You have a striped shawl in the middle, which is probably its own shawl originally. And then you have a paisley border shawl in blues and whites and greens on the outside border. And that shawl probably had a plain center to begin with. And somewhere over time, maybe recently, maybe 50 years ago, the shawl walas or the shawl dealers have put these two shawls together into one. So you have a Katra shawl and a paisley shawl. This is the shawl we started with, the one behind me, the all-over shawl. And here we have what we call rafugars, which is another term for the weavers or embroiderers at work. And this was the gentleman, William Simpson. There are not many images from these periods. It was before photography. And so what you find, if anything, is a few watercolors. And on the left, they're piecing together the shawl. You'll see a child there as well, which was not uncommon. This work is very fine, and often the way of making these shawls today may not be acceptable or politically correct. That was a little bit of a dark side. But in those days, you had multiple workers ranging from older gentlemen all the way to children. And on the right, you can see how they were woven. Very much like a carpet. You kind of had a weft and a warp, and you literally started with threads of pashmina. And today would be impossible to recreate these shawls because they're just too fine and very difficult to do this kind of work. Now we move on to a period that's often called the Sikh period or a Afghan period, based on who was running Kashmir or South Asia, northern South Asia at the time. And this is when the Sikhs took over, Ranjit Singh and others. And you'll see a couple of trends in the design of the shawl. You have the center of the shawl become smaller. You have the paisleys become more elongated, and the patterns become more complicated. But the shawl is still maintaining the basic layout or structure of the earlier shawls. It's still compartments. And while all this was happening in India and the shawls are being exported to Europe, you had contemporaneously Europeans start making shawls in Europe, and they made the designs more elaborate. And so the Indian shawl manufacturers had to compete with the Europeans. So this is a close-up of the same shawl with a green center. And you can see that the patterns and the colors are becoming more elaborate and more not as simple as before. And you have tendrils and vines and other shapes that are beginning to show up in the pattern of these shawls. Here are two more paintings of ladies wearing shawls. On the left, the same gentleman, Alfred Stevens. On the right, you actually have a Monet, Claude Monet, famous Impressionist artist. But you can see that these shawls became very much in fashion. They cost the same back then as a fur coat would cost at the time or today. They were considered very valuable. And it was during the period when you had these bustle skirts in Europe. And that's how the shawls were worn, as you can see in these pictures. This is what's called a duck egg blue center shawl. from the Sikh period. Again, the center has got even smaller, and the weaving has now started taking over the center as well. So these shawls were pieced together. This one, probably this part of the shawl would be one part, this would be a second, and then third and fourth. And so it might have been woven by 6 or 7 different weavers and then put together at the very end. And so very often these shawls will be harder to sit flat if you see them today. Another way of dating shawls is by looking at the borders. These harlequin borders, which were usually plain in this time period around 1830, and later on, they were always embroidered after they stopped being plain. And the more intricate these borders are, tells you how to date the shawls, usually to a decade. And we'll see more of that. And here's one which is a cream center. Again, quite similar to the blue center, just different patterns. Okay, now all of these shawls we've been looking at are what are referred to as chadars, which, as you know, translates to a sheet. So they're long and rectangular, very often 10, 11 feet by 4 or 5 feet. And then you had another type of shawl, which is called a romal. And these romal shawls sometimes had centers and patterns, and another type of romal shawl is called a moon shawl. And the reason they call them a moon shawl is you usually had a circular center and then 4 quadrants of that circle in the corners. And so this is a romal around 5 feet square, also known as a moon shawl. This particular shawl, what I'm trying to highlight here is we send it to India to be repaired. And this is after the repair. On the left-hand side, the bit in the circle, you can see is already been expertly repaired. And here on the right-hand side is a close-up, and you can hardly see the repair at all. So there are people today who can still create or recreate this kind of weaving, but it's very difficult to do it for an entire shawl. And very often the shawl would take many, many man-years to make, anywhere from 3 to 6 man-years, depending on how many people that you used, which makes them extremely elaborate. This is an unusual moon shawl, also square, and it combines a few elements. It's a khatra shawl, which means it's striped, and it's also a transparent design, so that you can, in the weaving, not only were you creating this stripe, on top of that, and you see it here as well as in the corners, you were weaving onto the stripe design the moon shawl element. And a few of these particular transparent shawls are in some museum collections, but they're quite rare. Here's another moon shawl where you see the paisley and the tendrils reflected, almost like mirrors of each other across the center. And this is what's called a 4 seasons moon, not a moon shawl, sorry, a 4 season shawl, because the way the ladies in Europe would wear it is the neck of the person is around here. And then 2 of the colors or 1 of the colors would show up at the back of the shawl and 2 would be hidden. And so in different seasons, you could wear this shawl, or even on different days, you can rotate the way you folded the shawl over your shoulders and your body to highlight a different color or a different season of the shawl, which is why they're called 4 season shawls. Now, all the shawls we have looked at so far are Kani shawls, which means they're woven. But at the same time, you also began to see the emergence of Amli shawls, which were needle embroidered. And today, this kind of embroidery would be amazing. in itself, it would be extremely elaborate. If you had a French designer in a haute couture house in Paris do these today in a dress, you're talking about, tens of thousands of US dollars of work to recreate it. But in those days, these were considered the imitation shawls. The woven ones were the real thing, and the Amli shawls were the ones for people who couldn't afford the woven shawls. But I would argue that these shawls were as fine and as rare and special. And here are some close-ups of the same shawls. It's very easy to tell them apart because of just the way one involved needles, the other was more like a carpet where the pashmina was knotted together. But these shawls, and almost all shawls made in the 20th and 21st century are embroidered. So if you go to shawl stores today in five-star hotels in Bombay or Delhi, if you go to the Taj or the Oberoi, the shopping arcades, or you go to other shawl dealers, you will mostly see embroidered shawls, but much simpler than this. And I have a few examples later on. Here's another chadar shawl, which is kind of a Four Seasons shawl. Now you see the center is almost shrunk completely, and the design has got extremely elaborate. And the border I was referring to earlier, the Harlequin borders here at the ends, have got a lot of embroidery on them. And this is unusual because the Four Seasons element is not in the center, it's on the sides into the design of the shawl. But again, depending on how you folded the shawl, you could highlight different colors. Now we're going to look at slightly more recent shawls. This was still late 19th century, but it's what's called a Zary shawl, which means they actually used gold and silk embroidered thread on pashmina. You've heard of Zary saris. These shawls can be very heavy because of the work. It involved real gold in the thread. And so you don't see as many colors. But these are sometimes still available. And this is something more recent, probably dating to midway through the last century, around 1950 or 60, fully embroidered in its pattern, but big center. So it's recreating the design of Kani shawls, but using more recent embroidery. And they can also be quite attractive. These are the shawls that you may find your older relatives have, and they pass on, some of them cut up over time. But this is an embroidered shawl from halfway through the last century. And these are a couple of examples of modern Kani shawls. In the last 15, 20, 30 years, there's been an effort to try and recreate this kind of weaving. But as you can see, they're very attractive, they're much lighter, but they are also nowhere near as intricate as the earlier examples I have shown you. And today, I think you will find people in India wearing these if you go to weddings, you go to colder climates, and not just in India, elsewhere in the world. But they're very different kind of Kani weaving. Here's another example, which combines the Kani weaving, it's a modern shawl, with embroidery. And now I'm going to end with just the last few shawls of something that people in India value quite a lot. These are called Rokha Shawls, which Rokha literally means reversible. And so these shawls are unusual because they're woven shawls, but they also have a layer of embroidery, highlighting some of the patterns, and they're reversible. That means you can't tell the difference between the two sides of the shawl. And here you can see the colors and the designs were quite atypical compared to the earlier patterns that I've shown you. They would often get more vegetal, more foliage. And this is a Dorokha from a bit later. It's mostly a plain center, but what you can see at the end here is, here's an example of the same shawl folded over. So on one side, I think the left side over here, you have the so-called front of the shawl. Oh no, actually, I think I've got it the wrong way. Even I'm getting confused. On the right hand, you have the front of the shawl. And here on the left hand, you have the same shawl, the same bit folded over, seeing the reverse. And it's very hard to tell the difference between the two. And these in India are considered some of the most valuable shawls. Finally, here's another Rokha shawl where they didn't put, so this is unusual because it's a 4 seasons shawl. You have the 4 colors in the center, as well as a Rokha shawl, and they didn't use any embroidery. So this is considered some of the finest weaving in shawls, where you didn't have any embroidery. It is just primarily the weaving itself. And again, folded over so you can see the front and the back of the same shawl, and it looks almost exactly the same. Okay, so that's where I would like to stop in terms of running through some of the highlights in my collection. And over back to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, Romi. This was absolutely spectacular. So does all of this sit in a book?
Not a book that I have published, but there are a few books out there that I would encourage readers to seek out. Usually they'll have the word Kashmir or shawl in the title. There's probably a handful, less than 10, published over time. But my own collection is not been published yet.
Will you be documenting? Are you in the process of creating a catalog or a publication of this incredible sophisticatory that we are seeing?
Actually, now that I have some more time on my hands, I am keen to try and display some of these shawls and perhaps put a catalog together around a show or an exhibition of the shawls. But it's still a work in progress.
So coming back to, how do you authenticate? And you've shown us photographs which sort of, give us a sense of the decade or the time. But how do you figure the provenance of a shawl? Recently, there's been Patrick Reedon Keefe did a fabulous new book around how people counterfeited everything from wine to worse. And how do you find the provenance to works of art like this?
I think there are 2 levels of provenance. One is obviously the individuals or institutions who owned particular antiquities. And actually, from that respect, shawls are very hard to pin down as to who were the previous owners of shawls, because they were generally owned by families, or very often when they were exported, they showed up in a household in Europe, and then over time could get sold. But the other type of provenance is, where were they manufactured and how were they manufactured? And from that respect, as I said earlier, shawls are very unique. You can't fake shawls. You can't fake these shawls. It's almost impossible, because it's such a difficult art and such a unique art to try and recreate today. So I think the authenticity of shawls, of these type of antique shawls in general, is quite easy to date and to identify. But it would be very difficult to say so-and-so owned the shawl unless it was sitting in a box with the name of the owner, and which does happen from time to time.
And Romi, much of what you showed us, at least the earlier collection, had the paisley as the abounding sort of reed motif. Is that because of the Islamic tradition or the traditions that traveled in from outside of India? Or what's the reason for paisley being the dominating theme in most of the woven traditions, at least in shawls.
Yeah, I think that's quite fascinating because if you look at paisleys, there are many countries that could make a claim to have invented the shape of the paisley. In Iran and Persia, the Middle East, it's also called the botte in carpets and other textiles. And it's not limited to textiles. So some people trace it back to the shape of a mango. Some people trace it back to, I think, more familiar in Mughal art is bent flower or shrub, where you start off with more of a little plant, and then somewhere over time, the tip of that plant became bent, and then that led to this design, which is an early paisley. But it wasn't until these shawls were manufactured in Europe, and in particular, these shawls, some of them in Scotland, in a town called Paisley, that the word paisley became associated probably as late as 1850, 1860 with this shape. And then obviously paisleys have been used in all kinds of fashion, from ties to clothing to shawls to fashion. And today, I think, apart from, say, flowers, they're probably one of the most common designs used in wallpaper and interiors, and they come and go in fashion. So it's I think it's a very important and integral part of the shawl story, both Kashmir and European.
And similarly, you've got, you had the wines later on, and of course the people leaf or the palm leaf format that you've seen again. And was that the sort of similar provenance of that, or did that also evolve over a whole period of time?
I think it's an evolution. Some of the patterns, the more floral patterns and the less Islamic patterns, were influenced by Europe, by the designers, particularly in France, who would have these expositions when, like, say, the expositions of Impressionist art that you had in 1857 and so on. You had similar exhibitions of textiles and shawls also in France. And there you would have French designers come up with new patterns and new shapes. And then it was incumbent on the Indian designers to go back and try and compete with those French designers that were done in cartoon form or on the jacquard loom. And so you did have this interaction and evolution of design between India and Europe, which was quite interesting.
Before we wrap up, Romi, the shawl and the carpet have become collectibles. Unlike, say, for example, the cottons of Murshidabad or the great silks from some parts of UP and Banaras, etc. What was so fascinating for people to basically collect primarily shawls and carpets, as opposed to also preserve some of the finest cottons that were ever made?
My collection is quite focused, so I can't comment too much generally on that. But what I would say is these shawls, because they're made of pashmina, which is quite a durable material as far as textiles go, and tends to thrive in cooler climates, are easier to preserve over time. Whereas a lot of the cottons and some of the silks that you find more in southern or central India or other parts of the world probably didn't hold up as well. So I think that is part of it. And then again, these shawls were very valuable when they were manufactured 150 years ago, and they're valuable today. So I think people have taken care of them over time.
Romi Lamba, Sagri Dayal, thank you so much for sharing this absolute exquisite collection with us. I do hope you are going to consider creating a publication, a volume or volumes of your collection that can be shared outside of your home and your friends and family. We look forward to welcoming you back at India by the Bay, hopefully live in 2023, where you could display some of this magnificent work. And we look forward to seeing your new, not your new, but your collection that you're displaying in Christie's in New York of contemporary art later this month in September. Those of you watching us from New York, please do remember, check out the Christie's catalog. Romi and Sagri's new collection of contemporary Indian art is going to be on view at Christie's. Thank you all, and on behalf of all of us at India by the Bay and Asia Society Hong Kong, thank you. We'll be back next month for another exclusive edition.
Jule Jule Lal, the Masti Calendar. Sevan di Sarkar, the Masti Calendar. Jule Jule Lal, the Masti Calendar. Sevan di Sarkar, the Masti Calendar.
I'm a big fan of India by the Bay, and I've been attending since its very first one in 2015. As an Indian and as a Hong Konger, it's wonderful to enjoy the richness and diversity of Indian arts and culture here in the city. So thank you to Lakshmi and her amazing team for putting on this beautiful show year after year.
India by the Bay is a phenomenal festival by itself in Hong Kong. Each year they've brought all kinds of art, be it theatre, music, dance, film, food and much more. I've just been one of the lucky ones to have attended every one of them. Just love it.
I have attended every one of the festivals that India by the Bay has brought to Hong Kong and have enjoyed the variety of performances they have brought to the city.